Hello, and welcome to the National Railway Museum podcast. In this episode, we're going to talk about everything food, where railway food comes from, who's involved in it, and has it always been gross, I think is a good starting point. And to discuss that with me is Chloe Shields. Would you like to introduce yourself, Chloe?
Yes, hi. So I am Chloe. I am a PhD student at the Railway Museum and the University of Strathclyde, and I'm studying eating on the railways. So my PhD is called Eating on the Go, Cultures of Consumption on the Railways in Britain between 1880 and 1948. And it's just all about food, what were people eating, why were they eating it, how did they feel about it, and what were the railway companies, what decisions were they making. So a mix of everything, I would say.
Amazing. And I've got to remember I'm not in supervisor mode, so my first question is not where is the next chapter, but where do you want to start this story? Because you had an object in mind to kick us off, didn't you?
So I really wanted to start with, there's a Victorian coffee percolator in the shape of a locomotive, which is called Victoria.
Of course.
It's not written down anywhere, but we believe it's because of Queen Victoria. And it was made for Swindon refreshment rooms in the 1840s. And we believe it's to do with Queen Victoria's first journey, when she first went across the railways. And we know that it was used in the refreshment rooms because there is a letter from Mrs. Gooch to Daniel Gooch. And Daniel Gooch, please correct me if I'm wrong, was an engineer and a locomotive driver, and he drove the engine that carried Queen Victoria. So she wrote to her son, to Mrs. Gooch, being like, well done, this is amazing, you're getting to take the Queen. I love the Queen. I feel a bit sorry for her. But also, there's that amazing coffee pot in the shape of a locomotive in the refreshment rooms, and it's beautiful and it's really funny. And it's really interesting that it's been used, because when I first saw it, I thought, oh, this has just been made
purely
for display,
ornamental, right? Yeah.
And it's going to just sit in a cupboard somewhere. And I know it was found on the head of the person for GWR, was it in Paddington Station? It was on someone's desk in Paddington Station.
Not on his actual head.
Not on his head, no. He was wearing it as a hat. Fascinator. That's how he got married. Fascinator on his head. No, it was sat on his desk, which you would, because it is gorgeous. So if you had that choice to be like, yeah, that's staying with me. So I just thought it was purely ornamental, but actually we know it has been used. Despite that, the reputation for coffee at that time is not necessarily great. So the first reference we have to coffee on the railways is believed to be Brunel. And he basically was like, this coffee is disgusting. It tastes like burnt corn. So a good start, and that was like the early 1830s, so right at the beginning. And then since then, I would say the reputation hasn't improved that much. So it varies depending on who you speak to.
So if we start with refreshment rooms, because that was sort of people's first often contact with what we call railway catering, railway food, because we've got some quite famous people, haven't we? I mean, we've got Isambard Kingdom Brunel, as you just said. Do we need to talk about Charles Dickens now?
Probably.
It's the one that everyone uses, but...
Yes. Yeah. So refreshment rooms had a horrible reputation, probably from their start. We believe the first one was actually in Glasgow, on the Glasgow and Garnkirk Railway. And it was basically someone who saw an opportunity from... they had a goods train that they basically just put people on, and were like, right, we'll take you into Glasgow. And... a gentleman called Mr. Wilson was like, I can make money out of this, and he set up a refreshment room of some sorts which sold a variety of things, but the most famous one is probably Swindon refreshment rooms, which was known for having terrible coffee, potentially rumours of people seeing the refreshment room workers pouring the soup back into the pot after they've left the station.
So you're waiting until passengers have to run for their train, leaving half a bowl of soup, and
you're
put that back into the tureen.
So kind of gross things. and and Charles Dickens kind of profited off that a bit.
Yeah.
And he told this story of Mugby Junction,
which is a fictional, but we assume it's Rugby state.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I mean, Mugby, rugby, it's like a letter difference.
We're not talking about high comedy here.
No.
Yeah.
It's like the guy from Wheel of Time who just adds in a letter to people's names, so it's like not, slightly unusual.
Yeah.
And basically in the story, Charles Dickens, it's not him. It's not in his own story.
It's the narrator.
It's a gentleman.
Yeah.
A gentleman comes to Mugby Station. He's desperate for some food, and he is a kind, polite gentleman. And he walks in, and all the refreshment room staff are just lying around. They're very vain. They're doing their hair. There's a page boy in buttons who's laughing at him. And on the counter are sawdust sandwiches. Now, sawdust sandwiches has followed the railways ever since. He wrote this story in the 1860s, and I found references to it in the 1920s. Even today, if you read anything about railway catering, the sawdust sandwiches usually come up. And this stems from his own experience of going to Rugby Junction. And I think what's really interesting about it is not the sawdust sandwiches, but how he talks about the workers.
Yeah.
And what happens in his own experience. So he goes to Rugby. It's really busy. It's a busy station. There's lots of people in the refreshment room. And as anyone would know today, you pay before you leave. But apparently not Charles Dickens. So he's queuing. He's got his coffee. And then he goes to leave so he could fill it up with milk. And the refreshment room worker, she had the audacity to say to him, "Wait, you've got to pay." And then a little page boy laughed at him. And he was so offended and humiliated.
And he does like a whole, like, don't you know who I am?
Yeah.
Doesn't,
Yeah.
famous author Charles Dickens, and she's not impressed by this at all. You put your money down.
Yeah.
And so he immortalises her forever in Mugby Junction.
When it's just like, how dare this poor, like, working class lady speak to me.
So what is a refreshment room? Because we talked about it a bit, but what actually are we talking about here?
Yeah, so a refreshment room is a little bit like a cafe.
Okay.
It is a room at a station where people would come in, and there would be a bar that they could go to and be served from. Usually you would be served cold foods like pies or buns or cold cuts of meat with bread.
Something you can get down really quickly, right?
Yeah. And then you could get tea, coffee, and then usually alcohol of some kind, although that could be quite contentious. They had lots of different rules about if you weren't travelling, you weren't allowed to use the refreshment room to come in and buy alcohol.
Oh, you had to present your ticket because it operated out of normal licensing out. Okay, so you could get a drink at sort of 10 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah.
If you had your ticket. Okay.
Yeah. And it was very much like a space people would go to be quite quickly in.
Can we call it the Victorian equivalent of the airport Weatherspoons?
Yeah, we can.
We can. But these are quite like romanticised spaces, though. Like in practical terms, they're very functional. They're a bit grotty. You have all these people, complaining about the quality or the service, or so. But they're also quite romanticised in fiction, right? There's some famous examples.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So there's kind of three main ones. There's one that I am currently in the process of writing about, which is essentially a story of two couples. There's two women and two men, and they meet in like a refreshment room, and it turns out they're all previously know each other from a past life, and then they all fall in love, and the older lady keeps trying to leave, and the gentleman is really desperate for her to stay, so he pretends to be a guard, and he runs out of the room to use the bathroom, and then changes as a guard and comes back in and goes like, "Oh, you've got 10 more minutes for refreshments," so they could keep chatting, and she would eventually fall in love with him.
It must be really annoying for the other people in the room.
I know,
who
just
completely missed that train.
Yeah. And they're like, "Oh, I suppose I'll have to stay here and be cold and eat my sawdust sandwiches."
Yeah.
And then the other two, which I think are more widely known, are Brief Encounters.
Yeah.
So that classic moment where they meet in the refreshment room and they're there and they're messing around with the glasses.
Like the romantic tension of that, like classic sort of black and white British film.
Yeah.
And it's an almost affair, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like an almost. And that sort of, the refreshment room is a place where like people sort of glide against each other in passing, right?
Yeah. And it's quite scandalous, I would
Yes.
say, for
Yeah.
the time, like at that moment of these two people meeting and they're both married, and they're contemplating doing something that's a huge sin. And I think the refreshment rooms and the railways in general at that time have like that kind of romance to them. It is there's spaces where you can meet people that you've never met before. You're going to meet strangers, and that can be both a sense of great excitement and like potential romance, but also really scary. Like you could meet an absolute psychopath.
Or small bears,
Or
which is
small
your
bears.
other example,
Yes,
right?
yes.
Yeah.
So the
A
final
common
example,
occurrence.
Yeah. I wish I would meet a small bear like Paddington. So the last example is Paddington Bear, and that moment, if anyone has seen the most recent film or read the books, where Paddington is in the refreshment room at Paddington Station, and he's eating the ketchup, and they're deciding what should he be called, what's his name.
Those are good references.
Yeah.
Yeah. But the dining, so if we've done the refreshment room, but the food doesn't stay, as much as the railway companies might like, the food doesn't stay on the platform.
No.
It moves on to the train. So
Yeah.
what's the sort of next step in this history?
So the next step actually is the luncheon box.
Ah, okay.
So the luncheon box is a bit like a supermarket meal deal. It comes in a box. Usually it used to be wicker baskets if you go really far
fancy,
back. And they were made by the refreshment room companies. You could order them before you sat on the train.
Oh, okay.
You could pick them up before you got on the train. And sometimes you could order them from a porter or a conductor on the train, and they would pick them up at a station later on for you to eat while you're sat travelling.
Because we've got examples of these in like
do.
the outside, not the
Yeah.
content.
Yeah.
So what would have been in these?
So
boxes then?
it would have been sandwiches.
Yep.
Sometimes it would have been cold cuts of meat with bread. Usually in like the mid 19th century, it would have been like a bottle of stout or ale. Sometimes there would be cakes in there, and then later on in the time period, so these exist throughout up until like the 1930s and 1940s, and we've got some beautiful examples. There's one with a willow. It's a cardboard box, but it's been done in like a willow-styled pattern, which is really interesting, the choice that they made to make it kind of look fancy for what it is. And in those ones, they had sandwiches, a piece of fruit, a little carton, and like a biscuit.
Oh.
So quite a good meal for a journey, but very much the equivalent of the meal deal.
But they're not for everyone, these things.
No.
They're like, unlike the meal deal, which might, it's a thing that was like Britain's most popular lunch option, I think, isn't it? These are slightly more, can we say elite?
Yes,
Or,
but especially in the 19th century. And there was a company called Spears and Pond who no longer exist anymore, but were really prevalent in the late 19th century and up until, I'd say, like the 1920s. And they were a catering company that began abroad in Australia, actually. They were both British people, so it was Charles and Felix. They'd moved abroad, started a restaurant out in Australia, was really successful, and came back to Britain and started working in refreshment rooms.
And this is like coming back in the middle of the 19th century, which is a thing where you think most people are going to Australia, but they've made money and they're coming back, which is really interesting.
And what is also funny is they have a connection with Charles Dickens.
Oh, right.
Because over in Australia, they had one of the restaurants that they owned, they had Charles Dickens go and have like a big performance. I don't know, do a big speech there. So I don't know if there's potential chat that he was like, the food is awful in Britain, come back, improve our refreshment rooms. That's all conjecture. I have no proof of that, but one day I'll find a letter in like la la la. But they were really successful, and they kind of changed the reputation of the refreshment room from sort of sandwiches to like this kind of more grand affair where you could have nicer food. You would be served table d'hote, which basically meant you had more choices, and you would have like a starter, a main, and a dessert. And the quality was a lot better. But they had these luncheon baskets, that they did, and they had them classed by different types of passenger. So one was called the Diplomat.
Ooh.
And I can't remember the name of the other one. I
Okay.
always think it's called the Plebeian, but I don't think it's as brutal as the Plebeian. But basically, they had a fancy one, so that had like the more expensive cuts of meat. It had a bottle of not champagne, but like a fancy bottle of like ale or
Some sort of premium,
a premium alcoholic drink.
Yeah.
Yeah, in comparison to what I'm going to call the Plebeian, which had like the really offcuts of meat, maybe a bit of bread, and it would have like a bottle of stout, but it would be like the cheapest stout you could find, and the price difference wasn't huge, but it was there to kind of say like, this is for the elite people, and this is for.
Because we're still
the lesser
talking about
ones.
a railway where you've got like first, second, and third class very distinctly.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's really apparent in railway eating. Like, and this is the other thing. The refreshment rooms for a long time was the only space you'd be able to get any food on the railways, other than if you brought it yourself. And that's not to say that everyone used the refreshment rooms, but that was like a big thing and a big option. Okay. What I would say then kind of comes along is, and to be fair, probably existed beforehand, they're just lesser seen in the archival material, is hawkers and platform sellers. So we know they exist throughout this time. There's like records of people witnessing crimes and they were selling oranges on a platform or chestnuts or whatever. But we don't, they're harder to see because they don't leave behind a paper trail, essentially. They're not keeping records that are then in a nice folder which has been donated to the Railway Museum. It's stuff on scraps of paper that you're never going to see again, and they're just people in pictures and paintings and without their stories told. But we know they do exist, and we know that they had a lot of railway traffic, and there's letters from the Caledonian Railway where they're talking about Glasgow Central Station and how people weren't using the refreshment rooms there, but they were using the stalls.
Because there's so many of these people moving out.
Yeah.
And these aren't, like, just to be clear, these aren't people employed by the railway company or the refreshment room. They're just people who just are maybe self-employed, turning up with a whole basket full of oranges, as you say, or buns or something, and just trying their luck for the day.
Yeah, pretty much. A bit like today, if you go to a festival and there's always someone on the street who will be selling like some kind of merchandise, whether it be like a glow torch or like a knockoff t-shirt. It was a similar kind of thing. People would just be there. And basically in this letter, someone was like, should we do something about this? These people aren't licensed. And the Caledonian Railway were like, no, like people will do that anyway. We may as well just let them be. And they made that then a discussion about who the refreshment rooms were for, and who was entering into the refreshment rooms. It didn't change anything. They didn't then go like, oh, we should change the prices and make everything cheaper so people come in. They just kind of allowed that to kind of happen. But they did eventually, actually, railway companies did hire equivalent of hawkers. So we have in our collections some wonderful oral histories, and there's one lady who talks about how as a teenager her and her friends, they would work at the railway stations, and they would be hawkers. So they had baskets and they sold chocolates and buns, and they would walk up and down the platform while a train was in the station. And the lady specifically mentioned how trains would wait at stations a lot longer than they do now. So it wouldn't just be the like 2 minutes for people to get on. They would be there for about 5 or 10 minutes so they could go up and down the platform, and you'd be able to open the windows so people would be able to like lean out and buy like chocolate or whatever. So she was employed by the railways to do that. And then the idea was that if it was really busy in the refreshment room, they could come back and they could work in the refreshment rooms as well.
Oh, okay. So there's that sort of like trying to make it official, trying to bring these people in house.
Yeah.
Okay.
And this moves on. So this is by like the 1960s. So this isn't like early on.
No.
But it's something that kind of happens throughout that time period.
It's sort of amazing, like the longevity of some of these stories that we're talking about, right? Because we don't have refreshment rooms anymore, but they're quite a recent loss, I think, like
Yeah.
specific company run, or then it would have been BR run refreshment rooms, and it's only quite recently that we've ended up with private businesses of like various coffee chains and things like that, and mini supermarkets.
Yeah. So it's really interesting to see the change. And yeah, because that's the other thing I suppose that we've not covered, is that they did have small stalls at stations as well. So it's not just the refreshment rooms where you're getting like hot food or like things you might get in a cafe. You're sometimes getting actual like fruit stalls or kiosks which sold coffee or cigarettes, chocolates, all newspapers, all those kind of things, a bit like a newsagent's.
But I mean, we're going to say like our journey goes on wheels in a minute and goes moving, but before you can do that in the 19th century, you've got to overcome a lot of anxiety about being on the train, and specifically what eating on the train will do to you. What's going on with all of that?
When people were travelling, if you were to use a refreshment room, you would either do it before your journey or after, but in the middle, you would wait for a train to stop in the station, and it would only stop for a short amount of time.
Yeah.
So the myth was that Swindon station, a train would only stop for 10 minutes. And in that 10 minutes, you were expected to have time to get out of your carriage, get to the refreshment room, get your meal, finish it, and get back on the carriage again.
Probably try and fit in a like loo break as well, because we're talking about a time where there weren't necessarily toilets on the train as well. Okay.
No toilets on the train.
So we're talking like real fast food.
Yeah.
Victorian
really
fast food.
fast food. And on top of that, you're not just one person getting off the train. You've got like, I don't know, it maybe you would be just one person, but sometimes you've got 50 plus people coming off the train, all to use the same facilities.
Yeah.
So it was an absolute mad rush to do so. I think the average was around 30 to 40 minutes, but considering how many people, all the things you have to do, and having the time to eat your food, it wasn't a lot of time. And these journeys were quite long. So when we think of, for example, if you were to go from Leeds to London, today it's about 2.5 hours?
Yeah.
It would be at least double that amount of time. Like the journeys were a lot longer, they would stop at more places, and like just a quick stop, not a refreshment stop. So you would be out for most of the day, and if you're not eaten, it could be quite trying. So a big thing for people was how this was then affecting their bodies, and particularly indigestion, which they referred to as dyspepsia. It was a catch-all term for a lot of different things, but essentially it was tummy trouble, usually indigestion related. And they were worried about the speed in which they had to move, the speed in which the railways were affecting their everyday life. So time kind of changed for them a little bit with the railways. Unlike before, where potentially, if you're going to catch a coach can stop and wait for you to maybe take 5 more minutes to go to the bathroom. A train wasn't doing that. Yeah. No, it wasn't waiting. You had to be there on time. So there was lots of stories of people complaining about how this was affecting their body, and particularly how the eating food quickly was affecting their body, to the point where there were leaflets and booklets on how to counteract that. And there was a great one by a guy called Alfred Haviland, which was called Hurried to Death. And overall, the concern was about how it affected the heart, but it very much also affected the stomach. So there were lots of tips like...
you're going to tell us when we should tie our shoes, right?
Yes.
So if we're following this, and like we're talking, these aren't like cranks. These are serious medical. Some of this is being published in like the Lancet and things. So if we're travelling on the railways as a Victorian, when should we tie our shoes?
Beforehand, before you eat.
Before we eat.
Because if you try to tie them after, you've got to bend over, you're going to hurt yourself and your stomach, and that's going to be you're going to get dyspepsia and then potentially have a heart
and that could be
attack
fatal, right?
This
is an anxiety that this could be like a fatal, not just like, I don't feel great, but like, I really don't feel great and I'm ending the journey in a coffin.
Yeah. And I think it's that key thing that Chris, I've forgotten his surname,
Valkoinen.
So Chris Valkoinen makes this amazing point in his book about how when the railways were first introduced, it would have affected every element of daily life. In a similar way to the internet, and how the internet has boomed has completely changed how we think about stuff. So even today, like, the internet's been around for 30, 40 years now?
Possibly more.
Possibly more.
It's a railway museum. We're not the internet museum. We're okay, yeah.
But it's still having a lasting impact. It's changing how we think about our everyday life. And the same thing was happening with the railways. And it stemmed from huge things to how fast you were moving around, how it might affect your body and your spine, to like small practices like eating. So people were concerned, and then on top of that they were worried that the railways were not concerned.
So we've avoided the refreshment room and its horrible sandwiches. We've dodged past sellers on the platform. We've avoided fatal dyspepsia. We've tied our shoelaces in the right time, and we're finally on the train. What facilities are there for the late Victorian traveller on the train? Like, what's developed by this point, like at the end of the 19th century?
So in 1879, they introduced the first dining car. So the dining car is a carriage where there was a kitchen. There would be a chef making food in the kitchen, and then it's a little bit like a restaurant. So it has, like the one we are sat in right now, it has small tables with chairs, linen, and people. There are servers who come and they will serve you your food, and you will have a meal exactly like you would in a restaurant. And when they were introduced, it was an invention by a gentleman called George Mortimer Pullman, who was an American who had come up with a variety of different ways to provide traveller and passenger comfort on the railways. And the dining car had been around in America for a good couple of years before it came to Britain, who were strangely reluctant to it. Okay. So railway companies at first were a bit like, maybe this isn't for us. And it potentially is to do with how different railway journeys were in the States to Britain.
Well, you're talking about those huge journeys in the States where you just have to have something. You know, like, whereas here, even though we're talking about longer journeys than today, we're talking about, is it going to pay itself on a 4-hour trip or something? You know, enough people are going to use it. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay.
And Pullman approached the Great Northern Railway and was like, hey, I want to introduce my dining cars on your trains. Please, can we put it on your Scotch Expresses? So the Scotch Expresses usually went from Glasgow to London, or Edinburgh and London, and they were roughly about 7 or 8 hours in the late 19th century. So quite a long journey, and these were the ones that Pullman wanted to use. However, they were really profitable, and the Great Northern Railway didn't want to risk this journey, so they instead were like, we can do it from Leeds to London instead.
So this is your trial run. It's like Leeds to London. We're not jeopardising that high-profile Scotch Express, which is like the Flying Scotsman service before we've decided it's... got to be clear, it's before we've decided it's Flying Scotsman. Yeah. Otherwise, Andrew will appear and chastise me for that. But, yeah.
He'll, like Beetlejuice.
Be summoned,
Yeah. And the dining cars were these really ornate spaces. So... if you know what a standard carriage looks like at the time, they would have wooden panelling, bench seating, and that was basically it. If it was first class, it might be a bit fancier, but in general, that was kind of the look of it. Whereas the dining cars were these really opulently designed spaces. So the Pullman ones would have wooden inlay throughout. The ceilings would have stucco plasterwork on the top. And the chairs would be upholstered in the most luxurious materials. They had Ottoman Brussels carpets on the floor.
We're thinking like completely over the top Victorian, like everything's got tassels and frills and way too many colour schemes. Yeah.
And you're thinking Murder on the Orient Express, that kind
Classic,
of vibe. Where, it was OTT. Everything was meant to look pristine, and it was this space for the luxury elite passenger. So particularly
it's
at the
not
start,
for everyone.
No. So in the 19th century, when it was introduced, at first it was just for first class passengers. It wasn't until the 1890s when they introduced spaces for third class. And when they did, they had to make a stark difference between the design. So in first class, you would have more room. the materials would be fancier, and then in third class it would be
wipe clean surfaces.
yeah,
So,
but
yeah.
would be still quite luxurious for a
Okay.
third class
Oh, okay,
passenger,
right.
but would just be less luxurious than first class. And
Just
there would
everything's
be,
toned down.
yeah,
Okay.
and there would be a stark difference. I don't know 100% why, other than trying to create an image of like class and luxury.
Yeah, because you're not saving
No.
money necessarily on that, are you? Like it's very much like an image,
Yeah.
as you say.
And they would go out of the way, so they would make the cars. So usually, so when Pullman made the cars, he would make them in-house at the Pullman factory, which was in the States, and they would travel them across, which was ridiculously expensive to do. And then later on, they would be made by different carriage works. But they would choose to make first and third class carriages in different works, which is like an extra amount of logistics, planning. It kind of, it doesn't make much sense from a business point of view, at least in my eyes. Maybe it does to someone else. But it was a stark decision that they made. And I wonder more if it's because the food they were eating was pretty much the same, because having the kitchen was really heavy for the train.
So there's only one kitchen that might be
Yes.
set. Oh, okay.
Yes.
Okay.
So usually what they would do is they would either have a composite carriage. A composite carriage, which would have would be one long carriage. In the middle would be the kitchen, and then you'd have first and third.
Yeah.
Or they would have two separate carriages and then a kitchen car. And to haul that along the railways was so heavy and kind of ridiculous. So they couldn't haul two of them.
Because it's like a fully fitted
Yeah.
out, like industrial kitchen, essentially, isn't it?
Yeah.
In a wooden carriage, which is not the weightless thing
No,
anyway.
no. And they would be serving like 6-7 course meals. It wasn't just like a
7 courses.
yeah.
Okay.
So you would start with your soup, maybe some fish, and then you would have your main meat with your sides, a dessert, maybe a cheese course, coffee course after. You could add extra stuff on, and that was the only difference they had between first and third, was that like first included a dessert and maybe steak, and third you'd have to pay to have them added
Oh, you
on.
could have an extra,
Which,
yeah.
it feels like any restaurant today when it's like £2 and you can have this. They were quite ornate meals that they made. They weren't like run of the mill. They would try and meet standards of the time and what was fashionable. So in the like late 19th, early 20th century, it was very much like French food, which was like in vogue. So they would have a 7-course French meal on a train while they're travelling.
And who's providing all of this? Because like we know through your work, we know something about the chefs and the waiters. Where are they from? How specialised are these railway workers?
So very specialised. They are usually within the dining car. The basic amount of staff you would have is the dining car chef, the at least a dining car conductor, and one dining car attendant, and then potentially a page boy as well. Sometimes you would have more of those. You might have a sous chef, you might have more dining car attendants, but they were the kind of basic staff that you would have. So the chef would make all the meals in-house, at least to begin with. I'll talk about it later on in a second. And he would be working in this very small kitchen, and it's rumoured that most dining car chefs were originally people who worked in hotels or worked on boats, so they were used to like small spaces, and also the motion of the train. So one of the things that you find in oral history is there's people talking about gaining their sea legs and getting used to the fact that they're going to be moving around and rocking while they're
Potentially with
serving.
a bowl of soup or something. Okay.
Which sounds like a nightmare. I've mentioned previously that I wasn't awful waitress, like really terrible. So like I would have just been like soup on everyone. I'd have to pay for everyone's dry cleaning basically.
So the stuff isn't always 100% being prepared from scratch in the kitchens, though. It's slightly, there's a performance to this sometimes, right?
Yes. So initially at the start it was all made on the train, and then as it gets busier and there's more dining cars introduced, they open what were the depots. Can't say the word. They open They opened depots at a variety of different stations, usually in London. So there's one at Paddington, there's one at Euston, and I believe there was one at King's Cross as well. And these were usually connected to big restaurants there, which already had quite big kitchens. And they would introduce a huge kitchen where they would prepare for all the meals that would be made on the... made and served on the restaurant cars that day. So it would start with, like they would bake all the bread or maybe prepare sauces and stuff so that things just need to be reheated and maybe just quick things cooked on the go. So maybe like steaks on the grill, which could be cooked quite quickly. They would be done, or sandwiches.
The soup's arriving in like a tureen or something.
Yeah,
or like,
they're not making it all from scratch. Yeah. And then alongside that, so behind the scenes, you've got the chefs who are there cooking or making stuff in the deep. I'm just going to avoid the word. In these huge store kitchens. And that was one of the ways, again, that people could train up to become dining car chefs, is that they might start in these stores and start off as like someone who's maybe just making pastry and then become a sous chef and then work up to being on the dining cars. And then front of house, you would have the conductor. So the dining car conductor was the head of the car. They would be in charge of the chef as well, and all of the other workers. They would be in charge of keeping all the bills, making sure that all the customers and passengers are happy, making sure all stock's looked after, making sure that everyone's dressed prim and proper. If you were front of house, you couldn't have your shirt sleeves rolled up, we'd be told off.
They're quite liveried, these workers, as well. Like we've got the famous jacket in the collection where the word restaurant is spelled wrong on the jacket, but that was never used. That's why we've got it. But they're quite fancy uniforms.
They're very much like the kind of Eton jacket you would imagine of like going to a country club or a butler in a big country house. Very, very Downton Abbey, like those kind of tails that they would wear for dinner. Perhaps without the tails at the back, because that's a hazard, but they would be very much dressed very smartly and different to other railway workers. So the porter or the conductor for another area of the train or a train guard, their uniform would be very different to the dining car attendants, and that was on purpose. They would purposely stick out.
So it's all about image.
Yeah.
And this image, like this sort of system we're talking about, like it continues into the 20th century, and then we get to the Second World War, and what happens with the dining cars in the Second World War?
So they are withdrawn for a period.
Okay.
And by that, it means that they were just completely taken off the railways and most of the mainline services, and there were only a few that were kept on for like special occasions. This didn't last for the whole period of the war, but it did affect the dining cars in huge ways. So workers to begin with, most of the workers were sent to fight in the war, and instead they hired lots of women to work, which was really interesting and something that had been discussed in the First World War but not come to fruition in the same way. And we've got stories of women who worked in the dining cars during the Second World War, talking about gaining their sea legs, talking about how heavy it was to carry certain things, the relationship with the chefs, and getting to know like the job and working as part of a team, and also some of the customers that they served. So one of the people who we know dined on the trains was Lord Baden-Powell.
Of the fame of the Scout movement.
Yes.
Fame, yeah.
Yeah. And one of the dining car workers, she tells this amazing story of him dining on the railways during the Second World War, and he asked for a sandwich, and they bring him a sandwich out, and because it's the dining car and they're trying to make it look fancy, they cut off the crust for him, so it's like quite a fancy looking sandwich, and she sets it down in front of him and he goes, "I can't have that, there's a war on," and then sends it back. So there's the complete irony of him wasting food, but he can't be seen to waste food because if he's got his sandwich without his crust on, absolute chaos.
There's a nice like crossover of very fancy sandwiches and sandwiches my 5-year-old will eat, which are the ones without the crust.
Yeah.
I feel like we've got through the war. We can't put it off any longer.
Yeah.
We have to talk about the elephant in the room, or the cheese and tomato sandwich in the room, which is BR Catering.
Yes.
So BR Catering has a fairly terrible reputation. I mean, the one that really comes to mind for me is the two Ronnies
Yeah.
sketch about this, and there's a bit where Ronnie Barker's dressed up as the railway worker and has this thing about people talk about how impossible it is to eat their food and how hard the pies are, and proves the pies are cuttable, but he actually cuts the knife with the pie, and that's how where's this terrible reputation of BR Catering coming from? Because they're still in like 48 and National Service, they've still got all the dining cars, right, and the refreshment rooms are still carrying on. So what's going on?
I think it's not completely down to the Second World War, but there's lasting impacts from the 30s and 40s, which lead to BR Catering being in the position it is in at that time period. So by 1948, rationing is taking effect and continues. So that changes what food they have available to them. And they are working with the Ministry of Food at the time. So during the Second World War and afterwards, they start introducing it was called like pies and buns, and basically they worked together to find what was a food or foods that could be bought quickly and would keep for a reasonable amount of time, that they could sell in refreshment rooms to lots of people who couldn't necessarily find or get food. So it changed what they were eating and how they were eating and what they were serving. And there's a brilliant video which is about the dining car returning after the Second World War, which is called The Dining Cars Strike Back. And it's all about the reintroduction of the dining cars. And unlike the ones before that were really glamorous, these ones were very scaled down. They weren't necessarily as fancy. They were...
Is that like wartime austerity, right?
And it affected everything from like crockery. We've got loads of posters in the collections being like, bring your own crockery, or be aware of the fact that we don't have as much crockery because those industries which were making tablecloths or making ceramics, they were out doing other things for the war effort, and then afterwards we were rationing from so it had a huge impact. And then in this video it has my favourite line, which is, wars will come, wars will go, but the sausage will live on forever. Which I think is the best thing ever. So the war had lasting effects, and quite a few people wanted to approach how does railway catering change after this point. One of these people was Portman Dixon, who... Amazing name. Great name. His first name's Ernest.
Oh, so it's Portman Dixon.
Yeah. And he was in charge of railway refreshment rooms during the Second World War. And he had lots of ideas about what the future of railway catering should look like. And one of the big things for him was frozen foods, finding ways to keep costs down, preserve things, the introduction of more plastics, using more plastic cutlery and crockery, and the change in who the dining car, who railway catering was for, which kind of leads on nicely to the tavern car. What's your opinion of the tavern car, Ollie?
I mean, I think this is one of those things that I wasn't aware of before I came to work at the Railway Museum. And I still think might be something that other curators are playing some sort of trick on me, like asking you to go and find the multicoloured paint, right, from B&Q when you're first adult, what is a tavern car?
So tavern cars were British Rail's idea of a pub on the railways. So they were the design of them was made to look like a kind of stereotypical
pub, is it? Like,
you've walked into Lord of the Rings, and there's a hobbit hole. No, there's wooden beams. There's
it's like an actual bar, right?
There's an actual bar. There. If you've ever seen Heartbeat, it's like the Aiden's Arms. You've just walked straight in, and they're carpeted. There's no seating, as far as I remember, or limited seating. And they've got names like the Red Dragon. They've been made to look very much like a pub, and the idea is to try and encourage that kind of clientele of people who are going to use a pub. So trying to encourage more working class passengers, I'm assuming, was what they were thinking, to use these spaces. They were not a success.
No,
People didn't want to use
these
them.
die really quickly, right?
Yeah.
As an idea.
Yeah.
Which is, yeah. There is one British Rail thing, which is, I'm not sure if we can say British Rail definitely invented it, but they were at least a popularizer of it that's still with us today, and people watching this video might be tucking into one right now, which is the triangular box sandwich.
Yes.
So what's the genesis of this? And BR sandwiches is its own huge
thing.
story, but what's going on with that?
So this was, again, like a BR thing to minimise costs.
Right.
So we have, in our collection, there is this beautifully written instructions on how to make a sandwich.
Yeah.
That feels like in primary school you had to do that lesson where you learn how to make a sandwich. It felt very much like that when you read it. And the idea was that you would place, so say it's a cheese or a ham sandwich, you're placing the ham and cheese along the diagonal line of the bread, which doesn't have any crust, so it looks like it's more full or fuller. So when it sits in the triangular box, it looks like it's got loads of meat or cheese in it, but actually it's only like one slice.
Yeah.
The back.
Okay.
Yeah. And these were just really famous for being bad, famous for the fact that they were skimping and reducing how much meat or cheese there were in a sandwich. And again, going back to some of the oral histories, there's someone who talks about how they were really soggy when they put in like the tomatoes, but people still bought them and ate them anyway. And remembering on... there used to be like a cellophane seal which said "not touched by human hands" or something, which I think is incredible. They're very much the basic sandwich.
Yeah.
And as we know, BR had a really awful reputation for food, as you mentioned, the two Ronnies, and they tried to change this. One of the things they did was they hired Prue Leaf.
Yes, of Bake Off fame, but this was quite early in her career. In fact, is she maybe the first woman on British Rail's board, which is sort of incredible.
Yeah, so she's the first woman on the British Rail board, and she's brought in to try and improve the food that they were serving. And one of the things they did is they had a stall at King's Cross.
I think it's King's Cross.
King's Cross Station, of all the different sandwiches. So they had some new ones that they wanted to try, and then like the basic ones, like the cheese sandwich. And they got people to come in, try them, and then vote on what their favourite was. Can you guess what the favourite is? I mean, I know you know, so...
Was it cheese and tomato?
It was cheese and tomato! Woo! So despite the fact that, I think Prue Leaf was trying to introduce like Coronation chicken and then maybe like a salmon sandwich, which to be fair, fish is a bit of a funny one anyway. Like it can smell a lot if someone's got a fish sandwich on the train. And cheese and tomato was the ruler. We're clearly limited palate in the UK at the time. She tried to do lots of different things to try and improve the reputation, but it still persisted whether or not it was justified or not. Yeah.
I worry that we're maybe pushing people's like gastrointestinal, we don't want like people to come away from this with fatal dyspepsia. But I feel like we have to talk about we have to talk about one of the weirder objects in the collection, which is the polystyrene burger box. And like by the sort of 80s and 90s, what's left of railway catering? Have we still got dining cars by that point? What's happening by that point?
Yes.
But
on a very different scale. So they're serving... they're not like doing as many like fancy 3-course or 6-course meals. Definitely not 6-course meals. They're very much aimed towards, I would say, British comfort food. So you have like the fry-ups. There's some amazing posters of like fry-ups you could get while you're travelling by train.
There's the kid having the burger and chips like halfway across the Forth Bridge.
And that brings us lovely to our beautiful polystyrene box, which is from the GNR. It's the last... Was it the last burger?
I think it was the last burger. I think it was ceremonially eaten by one of the curators here as well before it went on display. Obviously not 20 years later. I mean, you never know.
You never know.
About some of the colleagues, but yeah.
Did they describe what it tasted like?
think probably not great. Would be my guess. But I mean, this is the criticism that people have right now, is that the big change behind the scenes is the microwave, right?
Yeah.
The microwave has come in. We're all very used to having microwaves in our home, but in the 50s, 60s, it's heralded as this amazing thing that will come in and change catering on the railways. But it's all become about disposability.
Yeah. And that's a huge thing, because you see it early on. In the 60s, they tried to introduce self-service hot meals. So in Paddington Station, they had like a wall of machines which were there to make like burgers or like mac and cheese, like kind of what we might think of microwavable meals now. They had all these machines which were meant to, you press the vending machine button and they were to make them, and they didn't work. And people complained all the time, and the idea was they wouldn't have as many staff, so it would save costs. But in the end, they just constantly needed people to come fix them. But again, it's all about the disposability and really quick kind of fast foods.
Yeah, so the speed is the thing that we've kept all the way through.
Yeah.
And negotiating speed versus taste, I suppose.
Yeah, and just that challenge of like, it's hard on the railways. And profit, I suppose the last thing to think about is profit. Like, at the peak in like the early 1900s, there's points of maybe profit. But from then on, like in my time period,
this is a loss leader.
Yeah, there's no money being made, and actively they're being like railway catering are being told it's okay if you make a loss if it brings more passengers on. So it's, you know, it kind of feels, I feel a bit bad for all of the railway caterers, because I think that they've been given a bad hand.
So we've gone from like silver coffee pots through to microwavable burgers in a sort of gastrointestinal feast of what's available for you. Thank you so much, Chloe, for coming on. Was there anything you wanted to add, or?
No, I think that's great. Thank you so much.
That's covered everything.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening and watching. If you liked that episode, please leave us a comment and a like below, or please subscribe to the channel and let us know what else you'd like to hear about on the podcast.